Hello class, my name is Emily Boussiere and this is my Ayahuasca module for Botany 474. As part of this learning module, I will be providing an overview of the plants that go into the brew that is ayahuasca. I'll provide some information on their biochemistry and then also some information around economic, ethnobotanical considerations, how ayahuasca has been used traditionally and also new uses today, and then also some cognitive ethnobotanical considerations. Learning objectives. So following the completion of the ayahuasca unit, students should be able to describe the key characteristics of ayahuasca, identify the plants in ayahuasca and their botanical properties, recognize the plant secondary compounds in ayahuasca, describe the physiological effects of these compounds independently and also together, identify what research tools may be needed to further elucidate the origins of ayahuasca, compare and contrast indigenous and Western perspectives, and finally, discuss how Western cultural perceptions may limit the ability of Westerners to understand the indigenous cultural values around ayahuasca and the associated rituals in their traditional context. First, an overview of ayahuasca. Alright, so let's start with an overview of ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is an admixture of two plants. In terms of the preparation, it is a decoction, which means, which is the action or process of extracting the essence of something. This is often done by boiling or steeping the substance that you want extracted in water. And the two plants commonly used are the Banisteriopsis caapi and the leaves most commonly from the chacruna plant or the Psychotria viridis. The word ayahuasca is from Quechua, which is the official language of the Incan Empire. It's still spoken today in various dialects, most commonly in Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia. In terms of the etymology of the word, aya means spirit or soul. Some translations also translate it as corpse or dead body, and huasca means rope or woody vine. So this might translate to spirit rope or spirit vine, or potentially corpse rope, corpse vine. But of note here, the translation spirit vine is really indicative of the complex psychoactive effects that occur when it's ingested. And I have psychoactive effects here, but I just want to kind of harken back to our earlier module from Dr. B on psychoactive substances or psychoactive plants, and see if y'all can remember whether this would be considered psychoactive and or psychedelic. We can come back to this at the end, which is something to get you thinking as we go through this module. And then, the way that ayahuasca is traditionally thought of is it's considered a sacred brew that has a long history of ritual use among indigenous groups of the upper Amazon. Really the Amazon basin, but most commonly of the upper Amazon. So let's start with a little plant botany here. Ayahuasca plant botany, starting off with the bee caapi or Banisteriopsis caapi, is a vine of the Malpighiaceae family. It's native to the Amazon and the Orinoco River basins. In terms of the kind of physical characteristics, it is a woody, braided climbing vine, often seen climbing trees in its vicinity, and then it has large leaves that can reach 18 centimeters long and 8 centimeters wide. And then it also has white or pale pink flowers, making it an angiosperm. Another callback to an earlier lecture from Dr. B. Alright, and now a little bit of botany information on the P. viridis. So Psychotria viridis, which is also known as chacruna, is a shrub or bush classified under the coffee family Rubiaceae. It is a perennial flowering plant, so another angiosperm, and it is native to the Amazonian lowlands, but it's also been cultivated throughout South America and much of Central America. So given that it's part of the coffee family, this might help explain why cultivation has occurred more broadly than just in the Amazonian lowlands. All right, so now we're getting to the plant biochemistry. Another callback to an earlier module in the course around secondary plant chemistry. So B-Capi contains high amounts of alkaloids. If you remember, alkaloids often have pharmacological effects, mainly because they affect the central nervous system, so they are known to have some sort of physiological or psychological effect on humans. And so, yeah, the B-Capi has a high amount of what are known as harmala alkaloids, which include harmine, harmaline, and then tetrahydroharmine. All right, so harmine and harmaline are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Monoamine oxidase is an enzyme that breaks down monoamines in the body. There's monoamine oxidase A, which is in the gut or the intestine, the stomach, and then monoamine oxidase B, which is in the actual brain, mitochondria of the brain. So monoamines are neurotransmitters such as serotonin and dopamine, hormones like melatonin, and then various pharmaceutical drugs. And then they can also include many hallucinogens, such as psilocybin, dimethyltryptamine or DMT, which is the active substance in ayahuasca, and then mescaline. So by inhibiting the enzyme, the monoamine oxidase, MAOIs, such as harmine and harmaline, may allow these neurotransmitters to be digested through the intestinal lining, the stomach lining, into the bloodstream, and then make their way to the brain. All right, so the next plant biochemistry deep dive we'll do is for P. viridis. All right, so the active constituent in the plant P or Psychotria viridis is N,N-dimethyltryptamine or DMT. DMT is also an alkaloid, interestingly enough, some more secondary plant chemistry for you. And it is best known for producing brief and intense psychedelic effects when ingested. So like I asked you before, whether or not it's a psychoactive or psychedelic substance, ayahuasca that is, it not only affects mood, consciousness, cognition, and behavior like a psychoactive substance, but it also impacts sensory perceptions, including vision, touch, and sound, which makes it psychedelic. All right, so when you ingest DMT, it is typically broken down by MAOs, monoamine oxidases, like we talked about previously. And specifically monoamine oxidase A, which exists in the stomach and intestines. So it doesn't even get, into your bloodstream, which means it can never even get into your brain or affect the central nervous system. But when you create ayahuasca, you are combining B-Capi, which are made up of the harmala alkaloids, which are MAOIs, and then the P. viridis or DMT, meaning because the MAOIs are inhibiting the MAO, the DMP is not broken down and it can actually become orally active. And so this is why ayahuasca has that psychedelic effect when it's ingested. All right, so let's talk about some of the origins of ayahuasca. In terms of when ayahuasca first started to be used, there's been a lot of controversy in the literature about this. Some people believe that just because of word of mouth and historical references, that it's been used for thousands of years by different indigenous people of the Amazon basin. However, this has been largely contested due to the lack of linguistic or archaeological evidence. You might remember these different types of research tools from our research method roundup from week 2 in the Agriculture and Domestication unit. So think about what that might mean. If there's no linguistic or archaeological evidence, is there other evidence that could be utilized? What tools might you be able to employ in order to gain a better understanding of when ayahuasca was first utilized or cultivated? So recently as 2019, there was a discovery made as far as archaeological evidence, specifically a small pouch made from 3 fox snouts was found in the researchers or archaeologists discovered ayahuasca. This was in southwestern Bolivia, and using carbon dating, it was thought to be from somewhere around 900 to 1170 AD. So, somewhere around 1,000, a little more than 1,000 years ago. Other theorists suggest that the use of ayahuasca dates as far back as 900 BC, and the evidence for those claim are in artwork or paraphernalia from the Chavín people of Peru, who frequently depicted shamans using psychoactive plants. So, this is a little bit challenging to support because there is evidence of psychoactive plants being utilized. Whether or not it was specifically ayahuasca seems like it is still uncertain. In terms of the ayahuasca ceremony and uses, alright, so ayahuasca is traditionally prepared by a shaman, also sometimes known as curanderos, who are people who are well trained in the ritual or ceremony of ayahuasca, or ayahuasqueros, who are trained in the actual preparation of the brew of the ayahuasca. In indigenous Amazonian shamanism, ayahuasca had a variety of uses. So those might include communal rituals to bring the group together, ceremonies with singing and dancing. It may have been used for locating game animals, so potentially using the visions to help guide them as to where to go hunting. Divination, which is essentially seeking knowledge of the future or of questions of the unknown by supernatural means. And it might have been used in warfare and conflict, again, potentially to predict how things might go, but also potentially to try to get an advantage of over their opponent through some supernatural means. And then lastly, for healing, so this is like I think I mentioned this earlier, it also has medicinal usage or uses, mainly through the belief system that illness is in part due to misalignment or things going on within the body that are more spiritual based, and so by communicating with spirits you might be able to heal physical maladies. In terms of the medicinal use, it kind of reminds me of the documentary we watched on the Oichol people, wherein their use of peyote was also led through a shaman of sorts in their people that had been trained thoroughly and was deeply respected, and could provide spiritual knowledge as well as medical assistance. And this is, I think, also common among the different indigenous tribes that utilize or have utilized ayahuasca. All right, and so there's been dozens of indigenous cultures and also mestizo people who have used ayahuasca in traditional contexts. Just to name a few: Shipibo, Colorado, Tucano, Ashaninka, and many others. There's just so many different tribes that have been thought to use ayahuasca in that indigenous cultural context. All right, so for this last part of the lecture, I'm going to go over some of the more recent ways that ayahuasca has been used outside of the indigenous context, and as well as shed some light on potential cognitive ethnobotany perspectives, as well as some concerning issues around biopiracy and also cultural appropriation. Off, we have ayahuasca as part of recent medical investigation that's taking place, known as the psychedelic renaissance. So some of you might be familiar with the way in which psychedelics were associated with the counterculture of the 1960s. It was also, or many psychedelics were being researched at that time for treating a number of medical conditions. And it was thought that they held great promise for some really hard to treat conditions. However, due to legal and really political pressures, these drugs were designated as Class 3 drugs, meaning they were illegal to take or even to research. There was a moratorium placed on research for a very long time. And then fairly recently, that moratorium was lifted, and some of this research has been picked back up. And so ayahuasca is part of this kind of renaissance taking place, where they're investigating the use of many psychedelic substances for difficult to treat conditions such as PTSD, depression, and a number of different mental illnesses. The concern here is that the way in which it's being investigated is mostly through a very kind of Western medical lens, wherein they are really just utilizing the substance, the actual ayahuasca brew, and potentially even isolating it further to consider the harmala alkaloids or just the DMT for use as just a medication, and whether or not this could be effective. And so I think there's some cognitive ethnobotany considerations here, wherein it's a very different way of thinking about the drug, of thinking about the substance, in that it can be used in isolation outside of the traditional context that ayahuasca has been used by indigenous people for so long. And so whether or not that's appropriate to essentially have done what might be considered bioprospecting or maybe even biopiracy to gain access to this material for research that may ultimately result in a product that can be sold and for profit, and whether that traditional knowledge has been exploited in that way, and whether or not there would be any reparations made to the indigenous people. Definitely is a hot topic. Another recent phenomenon is the globalization of ayahuasca. This is through a few different sources, so one of which is the ayahuasca churches. These started popping up in the early to mid 20th century. A lot of them are, or maybe all of them, I think, actually utilize ayahuasca, but also have a Christian context there in the churches. And so again, it's kind of like utilizing ayahuasca outside of that indigenous context, and whether or not that's really the way in which it should be used. I think also a lot of times churches are profitable, and so whether or not there's also potentially biopiracy or bioprospecting concerns in the fact that these churches are using ayahuasca for gain is definitely a potential question there. And then another thing to consider is the rise of commodified healing ceremonies, and these are taking place in South America and abroad, and these may or may not be led by indigenous people, but usually it's for non-indigenous people, Westerners, that want to have an ayahuasca experience, and so they are traveling in order to have it. Another term for this is spiritual tourism, where it's essentially the commercialization of indigenous spirituality. There's this desire to have that kind of spiritual awakening that I think the ayahuasca has been, kind of glorified to provide, and this Westerner desire to have that sort of experience. Unfortunately, it's been idealized and romanticized. However, I think a lot of times that almost obscures the fact that there are less palatable aspects. One that was noted in the literature is the almost like sorcery aspect of the ayahuasca ceremony, where the shamans are using supernatural means to connect with nature, with spirits, whoever might be. And so I think a lot of times Westerners might not connect with that same ideology, and so whether or not it's really appropriate for them to be experiencing this very sacred ritual of ayahuasca, it seems a little problematic. And because of that, I think it also kind of hides the complexity of the indigenous people's situations. They've, a lot of times utilized ayahuasca because of very awful injustices that they'd experienced over time and continue to experience. And so the way in which Westerners can come in and utilize this resource because they're interested in having a spiritual awakening definitely engenders, some ideas of potential biopiracy, loss of natural resources for these indigenous people, and just taking away their ability to practice their indigenous knowledge, their indigenous ritual. All right, that's it. Thank you so much for listening.